Mr. Chair and members, Senate Bill 1495 prohibits the National Guard of Arizona from being released from Arizona into active duty combat unless Congress has passed an official declaration of war or has taken official action to explicitly call forward the National Guard of Arizona to execute the laws of the Union, repel an invasion, or suppress an insurrection, and requires the governor to take all necessary actions to comply with the prohibition. With that, I am happy to answer any questions.
Any question? Thank you. Senator Rogers.
Mr. Chair, members, I first introduced Defend the Guard legislation in Arizona 3 years ago. I did so because I recognized that our country could not survive on an ideology of invade the world, invite the world, conducted in violation of the United States Constitution. It was a perversion of our sovereignty and good government, allowing our country to be invaded while our military was used as a tool to invade others. Arizona was on the cutting edge of the Defend the Guard movement. The Arizona Senate was the first legislative chamber to pass it in the United States. And now the rest of the country is catching up with identical bills being introduced in over 30, that's 30 states this year. SB 1495 will keep the Arizona National Guard out of undeclared foreign wars. In obedience to Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution and recognition that our southern border is the most important national security interest our nation has. This bill will help restore the balance of power among the branches of the federal government and incentivize the people's elected representatives to reclaim the war powers granted to them by our founding document. We now have a Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who supports this legislation. We now have a Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, herself an Army officer, who supports this legislation. We now have a Director of the National Counterterrorism Center who supports this legislation. With SB 1495, we will make good on our legal and moral obligations to our Arizona National Guardsmen by guaranteeing that before they put their boots on the ground in combat overseas, Congress will have put their names on the dotted line and have voted to send them there.
Any questions? Madam Vice.
First up is General Conley. Sir, please state your name for the record and you'll have 2 minutes.
Thank you. General John Conley, Arizona National Guard. Mr. Chairman, distinguished body, thank you for the time to express our concerns, the National Guard's concerns with this bill. And as Senator Rogers mentioned, it's been raised in Arizona for the last 3 years. It's been raised nationally in different states for better part of 10 years, if not more than 10 years. I think it started in West Virginia. And it's been tried in every state, and thankfully it's failed in every state. This bill is not passed despite much effort. And I think the reason for that is because it's very concerning. And my primary concern with the bill is national security. Our president, current president, has stated that the foreign policy of this country is to promote peace through strength. Peace through strength. That's essentially strategic deterrence. That we're going to project our military might across the world so that our aggressors, our detractors, do not try to take advantage of us. The National Guard writ large represents 40% of the combat arms of the United States. 40%. You're not going to win many basketball games playing 5-on-3. So we can't have 40% of our military sitting on the bench when there are very dangerous times ahead and very dangerous countries out there. We don't get to decide whether China's going to rise
30
and,
seconds.
and start to become an aggressor toward us. But it's happening. And without 40% of your team in the fight, you're probably not going to prevail in that fight. And I'm not sure why we would want to hamstring the president and say, we're not going to allow you to use the Arizona National Guard, or refueling tankers, for example. We're not going to allow you to refuel planes in the Indo-Pacific region because we want to make a statement that we need Congress to declare a war. Congress hasn't declared a war since World War II. It's not going to happen. But the dangerous thing is, if we allow the state of Arizona to be the first state to look the president in the eye and say, no, sir, I'm not following your order, they're likely going to take all of our equipment away and our money.
Your time
And
is
that's
up, sir.
not going to make the states stronger. That's going to make the federal government stronger. It's going to have the absolute opposite effect. And I'll stand ready to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you.
Thank
Any
you.
questions? Yes.
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Senator Rogers.
General, for the previous 2 sessions, your office has voiced concerns over federal funding. In the past 2 years, have you discussed this legislation with the National Guard Bureau in Washington?
General.
Mr. Chair, Senator Rogers, the National Guard Bureau is against it. The National Guard Association of the United States is against it. All 54 commanding generals of the 54 states and territories against it. The Enlisted Association of the National Guard of America is against it.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Senator.
General, yes or no?
Mr. Chair,
General.
Senator Rogers, yes.
What are the names, titles, and
Senator.
ranks, Mr. Chair, excuse me, General? What are the names, titles, and ranks of the officials you spoke to who informed you that they would support defunding the National Guard in response to this bill?
General.
Mr. Chair, Senator, with respect to the individuals in the National Guard Bureau, I have not spoken with the Chief of the National Guard Bureau about it, but I can tell you that federal law would require that our funding be taken away. It's not discretionary on the part of the Chief of the National Guard Bureau or anybody in the National Guard Bureau or the Secretary of the Army or the Air Force or the President of the United States, frankly. If we do not use the equipment, the federal equipment and the federal funds that we've been given to be the primary reserve, combat reserve of the Army and Air Force of the United States, then that would be a violation of federal law because Congress gives you money for the purpose of doing a certain thing or things. It's called the Purpose Statute, Title 31. And the Purpose Statute makes it illegal to not do the thing that you're supposed to be doing with the funds and the equipment that you're given. So it would get taken away from us. And it would be given, this fight's still going on. I mean, China's still there, Russia's still there, right? North Koreans are still there. That's, all of our stuff is going to go away and it's going to go to somebody else. And it's probably going to be the active component. So you're going to raise this large standing army, which is exactly what the Founding Fathers didn't want, in an effort to, poke a stick. I think this bill is a failed bill for a reason over the last decade. And I don't want Arizona to be the first state to raise its hand and say, no, Mr. President, we're going to take a knee.
Thank you. Senator.
Mr. Chair, General, Congress is the body which appropriates the budget, including funding for each state's National Guard. In addition, there are multiple laws, we talk about the law, you and I, such as the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which provide legal reinforcement by prohibiting the executive from withholding appropriations designated by Congress. Do you agree? Here is my question. Do you agree that an action as drastic and politically controversial as defunding the Arizona National Guard would require an act of Congress?
General.
Mr. Chair, Senator, Yes, and it's already been passed. It's been on the books for decades. It's called 32 USC 108. And more recently, that authority was given to the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Air Force, the Secretary of the Army, and the Chief of the National Guard Bureau in 32 USC 105A8. So those laws already exist. They already give the President and the Secretaries the authority to take our stuff if we're not using it for what we're supposed to be using it for.
Senator?
Mr. Chair, General, follow-up to that. I don't believe any member of Arizona's delegation, Republican or Democrat, would allow that to happen. Is it the estimation of your office that Congress would vote to defund a state's National Guard out of retaliation for a policy disagreement?
Senator,
Hey,
I
General?
can't remember. Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair. Senator, I can't remember the year, but probably 5 or 6 years ago now, over the objection of all of our members of Congress, our Apache battalion was taken away from the Arizona National Guard. So can it happen? Yes. Has it happened? Yes. Very recently, it's happened.
One final question,
Yes,
Mr.
Senator.
Chair. Since we now have a new SecDef, Pete Hegseth, and of course President Trump and DNI Tulsi Gabbard, and we have Hegseth to head the Pentagon, has your office contacted the Department of Defense to ascertain his current views on the Defend the Guard legislation?
General?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rogers, I have not. I'm fairly certain my boss has not either. But I've seen that clip. I've seen that clip of Secretary Hegseth. Maybe his perspective was that at the time, and if you watch the clip, he says he doesn't really know the bill very well, but maybe it sounded like a good idea. But as he sits in that chair right now, I find it hard to believe that Secretary Hegseth is going to walk into President Trump when President Trump says, "Hey, Pete, I need to send some fighter jets over to Japan to patrol the skies and make sure that we are trying to make sure we're curtailing Chinese aggression." I doubt that the Secretary is going to walk in and say, sorry, Your Honor. Sorry, Your Honor. Sorry, Mr. President. No, we're not going to do that. I think you'd probably get a very different response from Secretary Hegseth now that he knows that he's very well aware that 40% of his combat capability sits in the National Guard. For some things, airlift, 47 or 48%. Air refueling, close to 50%. The Indo-Pacific region is a lot of water, not a lot of gas stations there. You were a pilot, ma'am. You got to get gas in the air. Nearly half of the refueling capacity of this country is in the National Guard. Secretary Hegseth's not going to hamstring the President's Peace Through Strength initiative by sitting half of the National Guard on the border. Sitting half the National Guard on the bench. I understand what he said. I think if we did speak with them, and I don't have that kind of juice, but I think if we did speak with them, I think he'd have a different perspective on it now.
One final comment.
Yes.
I think you're broadly speculating what his answer would be, and to refuel aircraft who are not in direct combat is one thing, and to engage in direct combat in an undeclared war that the United States Congress hasn't declared is another. And I would just pose this last question. Having failed to provide me any contradictory statements, we have to rely on Secretary Hegseth's last statement. Would you agree?
General?
Well, Mr. Chair, Senator, actions speak louder than words. Right now, Secretary Hegseth has Arizona National Guard in the Sinai Peninsula trying to keep peace between Israel and Egypt and others in that region. Right now, Secretary Hegseth has National Guard members fighting ISIS in the Middle East, and we all saw what ISIS can do. They just ran over one of their sympathizers just ran over a bunch of folks in New Orleans, so we know how dangerous they can be. The National Guard was heavily involved in dropping the bombs on the Houthis that finally stopped them from bombing Israel and bombing our ships in the Navy. So if we're wondering what 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 Secretary Hegseth would say, we need look no further than what he's doing. He's using the National Guard of many, many states all over the world right now to engage in these operations. And if I may say one last thing, this bill, as written, doesn't just prevent the National Guard from engaging in war. This bill prevents the National Guard from even training overseas, because it prevents the National Guard from using instrumentalities of war, from engaging in any duty. That's what it says. Any duty that uses an instrumentality of war, a plane, a ship, a Humvee. Those are all instrumentalities of war under by DOD definition. Even a rental car. If I'm using a rental car for a military purpose to get from A to B, that becomes an instrumentality of war under some circumstances. This bill would prohibit us from training overseas, operating overseas, and it would, just the training part of it is dangerous to the 8,000 Arizona guardsmen who will not have the opportunity to go overseas and train with those countries who they may have to fight a fight with. God forbid Congress ever does declare war.
Mr.
And
Chair.
I think that putting our folks, our 8,000 folks, in a position where they're not even allowed to train to fight a war that we're asking Congress to declare is inappropriate.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
That's simply not what the bill says, General, and I think it's disingenuous of you to cast it that way, especially for non-military colleagues of mine here. And when you do that, it makes the rest of your testimony, with all due respect, General, less than credible. I'm just saying. Finally, could you explain the legal authority underpinning the United States war in Syria for the past decade, a conflict which has included the deployment of thousands of National Guardsmen into conflict? There's been no declaration of war. 2001 AUMF does not apply to Syria, and no invocation of the War Powers Act.
Yes, Mr.
Yes,
Chair.
General.
Senator. First of all, Senator, I just quoted the exact language, the direct language, instrumentality of war. We can't perform any duty using an instrumentality of war. You can look up the DOD definition of instrumentality of war. You don't have to take my word for it. With respect to the constitutional underpinning, the preamble to the Constitution says that Congress will provide for the common defense. Article 1 of the Constitution says that Congress shall provide for the common defense. Article 1 of the Constitution says that Congress has the power to raise an army and maintain a navy, raise an army. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to enact laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its other powers. So when the Congress decides that it's in the best interest of the common defense to take part of the army, whether it's the National Guard or any army, to take part of the army and use it to go to Syria or elsewhere for the common defense, it has that authority. It has that constitutional authority. It has the authority to write a law that says the president can do that with so many humans for X number of days or whatever it is. Those laws are necessary and proper for Congress to implement its constitutional authority to provide for the common defense and raise an army under Article 1 of the Constitution.
Yes, Senator.
Mr. Chair, General, first I want to make it clear that there's no confusion with non-military members listening to this testimony. I'm going to go straight to the common sense part of this, and my question is twofold. First of all, are you worried about the risk of losing your funding? How is it going to affect your funding and resources? And the other question is, can individualized guardsmen refuse to answer the call of the president?
Mr.
General.
Chair, Senator, thank you. Yes, I'm very worried about losing our funding, especially if we're the first state in the union to do it. We get $650 million a year right now. It'll probably go up because I think we're going to get an increased DOD budget. We get about $650 million a year right now from the federal government to fund the Arizona National Guard. That amounts to 97-ish% of our total budget. State of Arizona provides very little, comparatively, very little of our budget. So if we were to lose the funding of the federal government, we would not be able to provide the Arizonans the security and the services that they they need. It costs about $400 a day per guardsman on the border. So even if you wanted, there's 8,000 of us. Even if you wanted to take only 5,000 of us to make the math easy and put us on the border, it's about $750 million a year to do that. And that's without the equipment, right? Because we wouldn't have the equipment anymore. We'd just be standing there, I guess, in a Red Rover game or something, try to stop people. And remember this, Arizonans have already paid billions of dollars in taxpayer funding, taxpayer money to the federal government to provide those border services. Now we'd be turning around and asking them to pony up again to pay for those services a second time by funding their National Guard, which should be federally funded. So yes, I'm very concerned about that. Can an Arizona Guardsman say no? No, not unless they want to be charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for Article 92, failure to obey a lawful order. Once the president says you're going, the switch is flipped. We take a dual oath. We take an oath to be in the National Guard of Arizona. Simultaneously, we take an oath to be in the National Guard of the United States, which is a separate federal entity. So when these kids take that oath, and I've taken that oath, and the president says you're going, and you say no, you have just violated an order from the president of the United States, and you could be prosecuted on the Uniform Code of Military Justice for it.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Any other questions? Thank you. Madam Vice?
Thank you very
sir.
much.
Nathan Madden. Please state your name for the record. You'll have 2 minutes.
Nathan Madden from Buckeye, Arizona. First, I'd just like to thank the sponsor of the bill, Senator Rogers, and all of the co-sponsors who have signed on to this. As it was stated, this has been a fight for about 3 years. This is the third session that this has come into, and I've been here for all 3 of them. And I will just say that in the 3 years that I've been here, that's the first time that the Brigadier General has had a bit of a shakeup. But continuing on, the support for this bill has only grown in this time. We've seen, obviously, the state Senate of Arizona was the first to pass it out of the floor. And since then, there have been numerous other states that it has been introduced in and passed through at least one of the houses. The primary barriers here were in the House committees. Those barriers are now no longer a factor. And I believe that if this body does push this forward and the floor pushes it forward again, the House will have no issues. And as was said, the new Secretary of Defense, he has shown support and endorsed this bill in other states. I believe that he would do so with this one as well. I actually have a quote here from him, but I'm not sure if I have enough time.
You have 30 seconds left.
All right. Defense Secretary Hegseth endorsed the Defend the Guard legislation after it was put forward in New Hampshire in the House of Representatives with a bipartisan majority. He said, New Hampshire is simply pointing out that it's supposed to be the Congress that declares war. It has become an executive branch function, and as a result, unless the Congress declares war, New Hampshire doesn't have to send troops for foreign wars. To me, it makes a lot of sense. I spent most of my career as a National Guardsman, deployed multiple times with the National Guard to foreign wars. We got used to the idea that the state National Guard are part of the expeditionary forces, which is not traditionally the use of the National Guard. And so this is New Hampshire saying we don't trust how the federal government is going to use our troops, so we're willing to commit them when the American people, through their elected branch in Congress, commits those troops to a foreign war. Then you can. I love this idea. I'm sure the National Guard Bureau is, excuse me. I love states exerting their influence through a system of federalism and the idea of protecting a prerogative of, why were we sending some guy to the New Hampshire, to the eastern province of Afghanistan when you have a northern border problem or floods that happen in New Hampshire? They're not there to provide support for that. It's an interesting development. It'll be interesting to see if other legislatures do this and how the military reacts to it.
Your time is up, Mr. Madden.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Any questions?
Move on. Any questions? Thank you.
Miss Rebecca Massey. State your name for the record in 2 minutes.
Yes, so my name is Rebecca Massey. I'm out of Surprise, Arizona, specifically Senator Sham's district in LD 29 and Congressional District 9 under Paul Gosar. I'm here today to represent myself, but I am a registered member of the Arizona Libertarian Party, if any of you are curious, and the shirt didn't give it away. Daniel Webster once said that it will be the solemn duty of the state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia and to interpose between the citizens and arbitrary power, and in the context he meant that was by the federal government. The National Guard, in and of itself, as far as branches of the military goes, it's a very unique animal. It sort of has a duality, or it's a two-sided coin. There's federal obligations, and then there are state obligations. There are two, in addition to the constitutional provisions that have already been mentioned, there are two different items in the United States Code. Title 10 gives the federal license, essentially, to use the National Guard and defers that command to the Commander-in-Chief. Title 32 commands that to that very same power to the matter of the states, and specifically the governor as the commander-in-chief, de facto, essentially, for the states. The National Guard has essentially been used since, like we said, Congressional Declaration of War has last occurred in World War II, so anything in years from then till now, you're talking about, it's become the backbone, and that was never what it was intended to do. It was intended to be a ready reserve, and there's numbers that suggest about 450,000 combined members between the Army and Air branches that exist. Since 2001, about 45% of the Guardsmen have been participating in the global war on terror, and about 18% of the casualties from those events came from Guardsmen. There's about 48% of our foreign peacekeeping operations that the Guard is being used for. And again, a congressional declaration of war is supposed to be a requirement. That is something that should be honored. And there is, as far as...
30 seconds.
Yep. So there's been some recent bipartisan support, and as recently as even earlier this month, the Virginia House of Delegates passed it 99-0. It has numerous mentions of support from cabinet members, existing federal senators, state senators. I know Mr. Gosar, Representative Gosar, does endorse it as well. And then the congressman from Kentucky that shares the same last namesake as I has also said he, quote, loves this bill, and so do I. So I implore you to vote yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Massey. Thomas Deaton.
Hello, my name is Thomas Deaton. I'm the first vice chair of the Arizona Libertarian Party, and I have testimony from one of our members that I'd like to share with the committee, if someone could grab that. I'm also a veteran, as my father was in Vietnam, as my grandfather was in World War II, and this has left me especially keen to the fact that we do need the military, but we also need to make sure that we're using that military with the appropriate forethought and authorization behind it. This becomes even more true when we're considering the Guard, because these are the people who their lives didn't permit them to join the full active duty military, and so they have other commitments, they have less comprehensive training behind them, and we're sending them to war way more often than we should be without that proper forethought and authorization. And so I would encourage you guys to put this bill forward and pass it.
Any questions? Thank you, sir. All right. That's 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Well, it was 1 against and 2 for. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I move Senate Bill 1495 with a due pass recommendation.
Do I get it closer on Mark?
If you would like, yes.
Mr. Chair.
But let me move it first, right?
Okay.
Because we're moving it. Was there an amendment?
There was no amendment.
Okay, yeah.
Oh,
Go
yeah, I
ahead.
can do it in my vote.
We'll do discussion now, so go.
Do you want to do discussion?
I'll just do it in my vote.
All right, good. Madam Secretary.
Senator Mr. Chair, I'd like to explain my vote.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to thank General Conley for his testimony here today. I found your testimony to be credible. You are clearly the most qualified and credible individual who came to speak to us today, and I apologize for the indignity of having that called into question, and I vote no.
Senator Dunn. Senator Gonzalez.
No.
Senator Miranda.
No.
Senator Rogers.
Mr. Chair, may I explain my vote?
Yes.
To my colleague who called it indignity. We are a constitutional republic. And if I can't question the blood and treasure that gets decided upon to be spilled for our nation, then we have a problem. SB 1495 does not affect Title 32 domestic missions or overseas training. It relates only to combat operations. I say again, it only relates to combat operations. The National Guard is the backbone of the United States Armed Forces and will continue to be. But the people's elected representatives must fulfill their oath of office and vote to declare war as required by Article 1, Section 8. A war that a majority of Congress is unwilling to vote for is a war that is not in America's interests and should not be fought. The most important national security priority is securing our southern border and restoring American sovereignty, not policing the world. And I would just close by saying it's interesting to me that the person who is against it is of general officer rank, and the persons who are for this bill are the rank and file who are fighting our wars. And with that, I vote aye.
Senator Shan.
Aye.
Senator Gown.
Waiting on a member.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
just a quick question. Is there a rule about holding a vote after you've called us to vote? Maybe staff can answer that. Okay.
Aye. Aye.
4 ayes, 3 nays.
Members, 4 ayes, 3 nays, and 0 not vote, and you've given Senate Bill 1495 a due pass recommendation.
Thank you, members.